Today's scripture lesson comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 10 through 20. Now, there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and be gone." And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they set him on the way with his wife and all that he had.
Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? It's hard to be a neighbor. Jesus and Mr. Rogers made it all look so easy. But for all of us who are not the Son of God, or do not look as good in a cardigan, this neighbor thing, this getting along with and living with one another, is not all it's cut out to be sometimes. If you look at Jesus or Mr. Rogers, any ease of being that we attribute to them likely misses the intentionality of them making their own lives pliable to God's will. So this act of being neighbors, of being Christians, is going to take a lot of effort on our part, more than a sprinkle of grace. Because in making ourselves pliable to God's will, to having that kingdom come, we are going to need to consider what we do when we fall short. If we look past Abram, that patriarch, that founder of the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we ultimately find a person. Today we witness that person, this man Abram, fleeing famine and fearing for his life. What do you do with the fear that you feel? Although Abram has just been promised protection and love from God for generation after generation, we witness Abram's fear of this world being greater than his fear of God. What do you do with the fear that you feel? We witness Abram casting judgment on Pharaoh, assuming that Pharaoh wishes him harm. Abram encountered his neighbor and believed he knew him. What do you do with the fear that you feel? This is a fracture point where paths diverge. Abram approaches Egypt and decides to play it safe. We truly do not know whether this threat to Abram's life was real or perceived. What do you do with the fear that you feel? Whether there was a real or an imagined threat is ultimately not relevant, because the fact of the matter is Abram felt threatened and responded thus. This decision begins and it ends with Abram. Do we see Abram consult God? Does he ask Sarah for her opinion? Does he ask any of the local Egyptians or even Pharaoh himself whether he is safe? No. Abram's decision begins and ends with Abram. But we know that's not fully true. Because even though Abram made this decision by himself, for himself, we know that this decision affects many people. What do you do with the fear that you feel? I like to choose my neighbors. We are all the same. I won't go to you, but you'll come to me because that's the neighbor game. Before we cast judgment on Abram, we must ask ourselves, are we any different? Do we wait for people to come in and prove that they can be our neighbors? Or do we stay in what is familiar, what is safe? Abram went to someone else's neighborhood and judged them before he ever took a moment to know them. Are we any different? Is it the end of the world is it the end of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam if we find that Abram sinned? Or are we pulling a prophet off of a pedestal to be more faithful to God? Or is this an endeavor to satisfy our own egos or to soothe religious trauma by bringing everyone down with us? What do you do with the fear that you feel? Are we capable of following imperfect prophets? What do you do with the mad that you feel? If we cannot have imperfect prophets, well then, Plymouth Church, we might be in a bit of a bind up here. Whether we like it or not, we need Abram, because none has had greater faith than him. If we are to cast stones, then we must know that our faith is greater than Abram's, and that's going to get real tricky, because that is not possible. But if we can have imperfect prophets, then we can go forward. And in doing so, we might glean some of that faith that can move mountains. And I believe we can go forward, that we can have imperfect prophets. In fact, we should have imperfect prophets. Because when it comes down to it, Abram sinned. Abram doubted. Abram cast off his wife and cast off his legacy without any thought for the consequences. In the first true trial of his faith, of all of our faiths, a test after being promised protection and prosperity, Abram chose the world that he knew over the world that God promised. And this could have been the end of everything. Without God's intervention, Abram would have avoided a perceived threat from Pharaoh, but in doing so, he would have lost everything of real value. Yes, he would have saved his own life, but what of Sarah? And what of those generations after generations that would never be? What do you do with the fear that you feel. If this was a world of humans, this would have been the end. Abram chose safety. He chose safety and the world that he knew, and he was rewarded with the world he already had. But God is not content with the world that we create, and neither is God content with the manifestations of our fears. When Abram fell short, God showed up. Pharaoh and his people are afflicted with plagues. Although Pharaoh did nothing wrong, he realizes something is up and goes to the source. After Abram had stolen Pharaoh's and Sarah's agency, Pharaoh shows up and offers a contrast to this man of God. Maybe I shouldn't choose my neighbors. Maybe they all should not be like me. But I don't know where to go. Oh, where could my neighbor be? Pharaoh confronts Abram with the consequences of his cowardice. And this confrontation merits consideration. In the Interpreter's Bible, we get a snippet from Frederick W. Robertson's work, Notes on Genesis, where he says this: "The man of God was rebuked by the man of the world, a thing singularly humiliating. It is common to find men of the world whose honor and integrity is a shame to every Christian, and common enough to find men of religious feelings and aspirations of whom that same world is compelled to say that whenever they are tried in business, there is always a something found wanting. Morality is not religion. But unless religions are grafted on morality, religion is worth nothing." End quote. Pharaoh, this one who Abram had assumed was ungodly, showed that fear of God and a morality that Abram lacked in a moment of cowardice. Yet, and you can double check this is the only moment that focuses on that Pharaoh. The story of Abram continues, and this interaction is left as little more than a footnote to our faith. This is not the last time Abram will fail. We know that he passes Sarah off as his wife in Genesis 20. 1 through 18, and like father, like son, in the same shameful way, Isaac does the same with Rebekah in Genesis 26, verses 1 through 11. So maybe it is right to be left asking, where is the vaunted faith of these men? Where's the accountability and the consequence? But in the same breath, we also must ask these questions. Where is it said that their faith was perfect? Where is it said that these people were perfect? If you will humor me, I hope we might remember today is a journey through the Hebrew Bible, a text very much alive in our faith and in that faith of our Jewish brothers and sisters, faiths which have one very crucial difference. When we read this text, we might unconsciously project our knowledge of Christ, our attachment to divine infallibility, a concept which is a theological tripwire. And this raises the stakes and magnifies all blunders by both prophets and disciples. Now, I do worry about driving a point too far, but the stakes are too high. As Christians, we emulate Christ. but in our imperfection, in the flaws and the sin that is bound to define us, the very reasons for our longing for grace, for that miracle of Christ's resurrection. We might forget that for us mere humans, failure is always the expectation, is the default result without God in the equation. Today we witness the results of Abram reacting to the world he knew. But we remember Abram for casting that world aside and moving towards that which God promised. I want to be your neighbor. I want to know you too. And though you seem strange, I'll try to change, because that's what Christ asks me to do. Judgment is a dead end that ignores the realities that exist after decisions have been made and all seats have cleared. We can render judgments, can decide who is or is not our neighbor, but we cannot escape the ripples that emanate from our decisions. It is right to look at Abram and remember that he is a person. If we make the mistake to elevating him to the level of an idol, of worshiping him, forgetting that Abram is not God, we lose sight of the reason that we are drawn to Abram. Abram made mistakes, but the strength of his faith was enough to build 3 religions on. God saw Abram and knew him completely, and chose him anyways. Forgiving does not mean forgetting. But maybe you want to hear a harsher criticism of Abram. I hear reading in my head a criticism I received last night where in this sermon it felt like a typical evaluation by a man of a man that says, boys will be boys, but we have to deal with it. If so, I do apologize. I cannot control what you hear, but I can clarify that today's word does not give Abram a pass, does not brush aside the atrocity of handing Sarah off without concern for her well-being. Truly, if we had more time, this moment alone does merit a sermon by itself. But this comes already at the risk of pulling apart all points, of becoming so nebulous that this good word for today might scatter and lose its purpose of instruction and application. So let us remember, we do not just move on when mistakes are made. These ripples move out and touch and shape the experiences of everyone. That is why we define sin as anything that draws us away from God, as societal harm. God is always with us. But if we do not recognize the harm that is around us, do not come to terms with the wounds we inflict on others as well as the wounds we receive, we will constantly scramble for a false safety that is only of this world. Like Abram, we will be rewarded with the world that we know. You know this safety. It's a world where more and more powers have nuclear weapons simply because it would be a shame to be late to this game of global annihilation. This is a world of tariffs, taxes, manipulation, and coercion that lets the suffering of another person or another country be viewed as profitable or beneficial because in the back of our minds we declare, thank God, that's not me. How many of us have been afraid of Pharaoh, of the other, that we have let ourselves be stuck in cycle upon cycle of responding to enemies before we bother to know them as foe or friend. What do you do with the fear that you feel? Every week, we are reminded that we are made in God's image, that we are children of God, and God's creation is good. But when we leave these doors, do we know our neighbors? Or do we choose our neighbors? Where are those you disagree with? Where are those who do not look like you and who do not think like you, who are a stranger in every way except for the manner of their being? Like Abram, we are being asked to leave behind the world that we know, the world that we've been used to responding to, because God calls us to a promised land, and it's not the one that we have made. We will make our homes among those we would call enemies, among those who would deny us, and we will know them as friends because God's possibilities are greater than our limitations. What do you do with the mad that you feel? What do you do with the fear that you feel? These are the questions that guided you through this day. But the question I leave you with, the question we must pray on is, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor?